All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Apologies for the technical difficulties earlier. We're going to go ahead and get this started. I wanted to welcome everyone to our diversity and inclusion panel for Homecoming at Home. I'm Stephanie Apia. I'm the head of financial affairs for the Mason Alumni of Color Network. This is one of our earliest events, and I'm super excited to be involved in this. I'm going to invite Dean Pulley on behalf of our network and the D&I committee to say a few words just about the process and really welcoming everyone to be here.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for another event in our Mason Homecoming at Home week. Not only is this event a panel discussion, we're going to have a great professional development opportunity for our alumni. It's also a terrific opportunity for our students. Many of our students will be joining us, but many of them cannot because they're in other classes, but they will be tuning in later because this will be a supplement to their coursework and some of our core classes. I was very pleased to see that this particular panel discussion is being co-hosted by our Mason D&I committee and the Mason Alumni of Color Network. Our D&I committee is the successor to our D&I task force and is helping the Mason School become more D&I enlightened and more D&I effective in both our culture and our operations. They're also helping us prepare all of our students to add value to companies who are themselves very D&I aware and D&I focused. This panel is a signature event of the 7-program perspective series that the committee has put together for all of us over the course of this semester and year. After more than 2 years of behind the scenes planning, I'm delighted to say that we launched the Mason Alumni of Color Network this past June. And our moderator today, Stephanie, is a member of the leadership team of that group. The Alumni of Color Network provides programming, network opportunities, book club, support for the alumni community, along with current Mason students. They're even hosting a happy hour this evening as part of our Homecoming at Home programming. And now on to today's event itself. Wow, what a great group of panelists. We're all in store for a treat. Really, simply wow. I mean, I know our panelists, I met in New York over a year ago with Elizabeth. And quite frankly, she changed my thinking about D&I. And Melvin Greer has been connected to us through alumnus Bill Sullivan and has been spectacularly generous with his time and his wisdom ever since. I'm very eager to hear from Amanda about the D&I efforts and activities at Google. This is simply to underscore what should be obvious to everyone who has joined us. We're in for a real treat. And without further ado, let me turn it back to Stephanie.
So at this time, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just give us a little flavor of what you do in your non-panel life. We'll start with Elizabeth with your name, the year you graduated from William & Mary, if it's applicable, your organization, and then how close are you to our topic today?
Good. So I am Elizabeth Nieto. My pronouns are she and her, and my team will be very proud that I said it because sometimes I forget. And I am actually not a William & Mary graduate, but I'm a William & Mary parent. And when my daughter graduated from Global Studies, she moved to the Middle East. So I decided that I needed to continue her work with William & Mary and her relationship. And that's how I have been part of the Women in Business, as well as some conversations with Dean Lurie around diversity, inclusion, and other topics. I'm excited to be part of this panel. I am, oh, you wanted me to, what do I do? I forgot. I also have a job, and my job is I am the head of global diversity, equity, and inclusion at Amazon, and I have been there for 18 months.
Mr. Greer?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm Melvin Greer, And I am not a William and Mary graduate. However, as you heard from Dean Pulley, I'm a very strong supporter of the business analytics program. I'm the chief data scientist for Intel Corporation. So I don't spend, as part of my formal job, and work in diversity and inclusion. However, one of the things that's absolutely clear is that diversity and inclusion is directly correlated with business performance. And so Intel is a very, very focused company on innovation. And so I'll be sharing one of the things or some of the things we as a company focused on innovation have done as it relates to our diversity and inclusion activities. And then full disclosure, I'm also a special government employee where I actually work at the FBI as a fellow responsible for their artificial intelligence and data science capabilities. So I'm excited about being on this panel.
Thank you. Amanda?
Yes, thanks, Stephanie. Amanda Furr, she, her pronouns. I'm at Google. I graduated in 2009 from William and Mary with a business degree. And I'm at Google now, and I'm the diversity, equity, and inclusion lead for a few of our tech organizations. So very close to this work and excited to be here.
And for myself, I'm Stephanie Apia, JD MBA class of 2015. I'm at Bedrock Detroit, which is real estate, and today's moderator, but I'm also taking an active part with our leadership team on training our team members and hiring leaders on diversity and inclusion. So one question for all of our panelists. Oh, let me back up. For all of you who are watching today's webinar, at the bottom of your Zoom, there's a Q&A feature. You can be typing in questions throughout this webinar. We'll get to a section at the end where we will answer questions from those of you who are watching live. But we'll start the moderated discussion today with some questions that we created in advance. So you may see a couple of times in, I will plug the Q&A section just so we can hear from each person who's watching today's webinar. So we'll start with, for each of you, what do you consider to be the #1 challenge to diversity and inclusion efforts? And how do you address this challenge in your work right now?
I can go. Start it off. You know, there are so many things going on, especially right now, and I'm sure we'll dig into more. You know, D&I is certainly a big focus with everything going on externally. But I will say, just more generally, I think that we're constantly constrained by external systemic limitations, right? You know, within the DEI space, we're trying to affect change in organizations, but we're actually working against the limited access to education, the racial wealth gap, the gender pay gap, the lack of, you know, trans rights that we're dealing with across the globe. And so we're trying to fix something internally that we only have so much influence to change. You know, I'm lucky to be at a company like Google, who I do believe has a big influence and a big responsibility inside and outside, which we can get into. But, you know, culture change takes time, and we're trying to change behaviors that have been, you know, ingrained in us since birth and rewarded by a dominant culture for centuries. So I think that, you know, how do we actually work towards systemic change within our business is the key challenge for me.
I built on what Amanda was saying. Thank you, Amanda, for that, because what we see ourselves in many organizations where we measure all our other outcomes quarter by quarter or year by year. And these are long-term changes that need to be sustained. So I get asked all the time, how do we move the needle? And my question is, what needles? There's a lot of needles. There's a needle of representations, there's a needle of inclusion, there's a needle in equity, and we need to measure all of those. Now, what had happened, as Amanda was mentioning, the external environment had put a focus on all our work in a way that hasn't happened, at least in the last 3 decades that I have been part of this work. So it is not just the D&I departments or the people in HR that need to solve for that. It's really a work that needs to happen in all the organizations. So for me, the biggest challenge is when managers see all the goals that they have, and they also have goals related to D&I, that they put that as a priority, and that their supervisors are looking at their outcomes in the long term, not just quarter by quarter, but they can see what are the changes they are doing in their systems to ensure sustainability of the changes.
I think D&I is certainly evolving, and I agree with my co-panelists. There's a lot of external factors that are driving that evolution. I think for Intel, and certainly for me personally, the biggest challenge is that D&I remains some sort of separate part of the organization and not fully integrated into business metrics and objectives and accountability. We, for some reason, believe that diversity and inclusion needs to have some separate way of being treated, when in fact, the ability to conduct a business and the ability to hold people accountable and the ability to drive metrics is a core part of the business. And so D&I needs to be part of those same kind of business metrics in terms of performance and compensation and accountability. And by having D&I as a separate activity and initiative, I think it does bring some really important measures and spotlight to the special challenges of this evolution. But I think ultimately the success of diversity and inclusion will be how tightly integrated it is directly to business objectives and accountability.
So that takes me to our next question. And Elizabeth, I think we might start with you. So what does accountability look like? What's success? What are the KPIs?
Yeah, and they're a combination of those. So if you think about what we're talking about, these three kind of work. So in diversity is really representation. And sometimes people just think of representation, I will hire more people and I will just change that. And that's why, if we think about the history of the D&I practice, there was a focus first on just hiring as a way of, we're going to fix by bringing more people in. Well, we didn't create an environment where people felt included, that felt that they could succeed. So that's when the diversity piece came into understanding those two areas. And now the equity is kind of an outcome of how we change our system. So in our world, we look at input goals and we look at output goals. And input goals are the things that we can control. So if you think about having a slate for hiring, that's an input goal because you can control, you can do that. If then you end up with a star that it's, a person that has that happens to be from a diverse background, that's kind of the output. So those are two pieces that we look very internally. And then the other thing is around inclusion. And we measure inclusion in our organization every quarter. So we have questions related to inclusion and we can see what is the impact. We're now looking, for example, of some of the working from home and how that could or could not have an impact for those that are not part of the majority. So there's some of the metrics that most companies have used, especially around representation. But as we learn more and more and we go deeper into understanding what are the levers that we have, and we define metrics not only for those outcomes, but the metrics that happen before that. So that's, and how success looks like, we think that success will be when anybody, no matter what their background is, no matter how represented they are in the census, can come into organizations, see themselves and thrive. And that idea of being able to be successful in different organizations, no matter if you're part of a majority group or not, that for me is success, and it keeps on expanding. So what is fantastic about this work is maybe we will never be done because, 20 or 30 years ago, we were not thinking about veterans and how do we integrate veterans into our world. Today we are. So that's how these practices continue to evolve and we continue to learn through that.
And so then when we think about the inputs and the outputs here, Melvin, Chief Data Scientist, how does Intel evaluate inclusion or diversity initiatives?
So Stephanie, we do the same kinds of things that many of our peer companies and the panelist companies do. You know, we have metrics around how many underserved represented minorities we have in leadership positions and certain grade levels. But that's not the real motivation behind the metrics you see in our corporate responsibility report. Our CEO, just by chance, was at Fast Company's Innovation Festival last week. And the topic of diversity and inclusion came up because he spends a monthly session, a monthly meeting focused on it. And when it came up, I think people were shocked to understand that his perspective was not around those metrics that drive what I would call traditional D&I activities. What his focus is and what our focus is as a company is really on innovation. So, you know, Intel is a pretty innovative company. We have, you know, I don't know, something of 110,000 employees, 90,000 engineers, scientists, and PhDs. And for our CEO to spend a monthly meeting on D&I and for every senior leader to have D&I responsibilities is a big deal. But the reason is because when companies spend time on it, the stock price jumps. When they spend time on it, the company performs better. When investors ask questions like, are you building the right team? Are you building the right environment? How are you building the right culture at this company so that you can continue on this hockey stick growth that you're going on? The answer is not because we have the best silicon in the world. That's not the answer. The answer is because we hold senior leaders accountable for microaggressions. We hold senior leadership accountable for the not only the most egregious definitions of lack of diversity and inclusion, but the most insignificant ones as well. And the reason we do that is because no matter what background or culture you come from, if you're working at a company, you want it to succeed. And when you see senior leadership not being held accountable, then it sends a distinct message to the rest of the organization. And it provides a drag on growth and a drag on innovation, which is something we're particularly sensitive to. And so our goal is to continue to drive this idea, because when our investors and our employees over time find an absence of the kinds of diversity and inclusion programs that Elizabeth talked about in terms of making people everywhere feel comfortable and bringing their authentic self, then that tends to be more of a problem to our investors and to our employees. Now, this has nothing to do with your culture and where you grew up and what your parents taught you. If you're going to come work here, you've got to be focused on growing the company. And that growth is inextricably tied to diversity and inclusion. And there's no fancy way to get around that.
So Melvin, you're almost calling it a competitive advantage to be as inclusive, to be as passionate, to be as clear and accountable for leaders. To you guys, to Intel, and to many other employers, this gives them an edge over other people in their industries and pushes them to see more and even do more.
Stephanie, everybody's got an idea about how to compete better. Go hire a chief diversity officer. Go hire an innovation officer. Go hire a chief data officer. If you really want to become more competitive, take a look. Now listen, Intel's got foibles just like everyone else. We have things that we need to work on. But when we took a survey of, we're in, almost every country in the world, and we looked at how those senior leadership teams are made up, the more diverse they are across 6 different leadership diversity categories, the better they do. So if you don't want to work in a diverse environment, maybe Intel's not the place for you.
And so, turning that on its head, Amanda, what does it look like to encourage inclusivity in leadership? And how can we create to Melvin's point, more allies that strengthen the business, not only from the representation standpoint, but truly the action behind the words?
Yeah, to be honest, the buzzword, in the past few months after, the protests really started happening, it was allyship, right? Everybody wanted to do something. Leaders wanted to know how to say something. And the truth was, this isn't a new issue. I coached a lot of leaders through how to, seek knowledge and do the work, sit through the discomfort and really actively listen. I think, it's going to be uncomfortable to figure out how to be an ally because, many of us have been taught from a very young age that you don't talk about race. It's the perfect plan, right, to sustain one dominant culture. But, we really have to build that muscle. And a lot of our leaders have to build that muscle as well in organizations, right? For Black and Latinx folks, they don't get the privilege to ignore that. And so we have to, really just look it in the eye and sit through the discomfort. You can't speak up once and not continue to do the work. You have to continue. When it comes to inclusive leadership, there are 1,000 traits and behaviors that you can practice, right? You can be more collaborative. You can focus on cultural intelligence. You can focus on commitment. But where the rubber really meets the road, in my opinion, is how you put it into action, just like you said, Stephanie. So, really focusing on doing something little by little to change, focusing on a few behaviors that you can do, that you can control and put into action. That's what's going to really drive change time over time. It can be really overwhelming to, really look at everything and say, I want to fix it all. And that's kind of what a lot of people said, right? They're like, I just want to change everything, right? We have resources, we can go. But the truth is, the biggest changes you can make and affect are with your teams day to day, with people from underrepresented groups on your teams, in your organizations, making those changes and making those differences in an equitable fashion as a leader.
So then on that point, and I think this is really a question to all the panelists, how have companies, and I say speak for your companies, but how have you been able to facilitate those conversations around events like the death of George Floyd or Jacob Blake or Breonna Taylor? How have you been able to facilitate that type of conversation in the workplace? And what are the expectations around how leaders carry that conversation to their teams, or the behaviors and things that we deal with in the workplace as a result of these issues?
So it has been very interesting. And I think that we are a critical, pivotal time where we had an opportunity, and like many companies, we took this, a really tragic event. Let's use the time where everybody is shocked to listen to our employees. So like many other companies, so we were not the only ones. We brought our most senior leaders with Black employees from around the world, from the US, from the UK. We have a big representation in Luxembourg and South Africa. And we opened a conversation where we told our leaders in front of our Black employees, you're supposed to listen. Don't come and fix. What you usually do is you're gonna listen to a problem, you're gonna try to fix. We want you to hear what it is to be Black in the US, what it is to be Black in the world, what it is to be Black at Amazon. And I have to say, for anybody that have worked with senior leaders, getting into their calendar, it's in itself impossible. We had in 3 days availability for every senior leader that sat down in more one of these sessions. So that really got them for the first time to, as Amanda said, this is not new, but for some people, this is the first time that they get to listen to these stories in a different way, and taking the commitment to say, we cannot find ourselves having the same conversations in 2 years and saying that we have not fixed at least the things that we can fix internally. And let's look for our processes, our mechanisms, and find, do we have systemic obstacles that were not created to be obstacles for a group or the other one, that but may have had that impact. And let's go and inspect everything that we do in the way we engage with our candidates, in the way we engage when we interview, the way we engage with our employees, and try to go. And And again, we are going through this process of inspecting and engaging our senior leaders in taking time and looking for the vocabulary and coding that many of us have been in technology will know that we use in coding master and slave, and that has been forever. And people kept on saying, oh, that's not that important. Well, today it is important because language matters, and we're going to invest the resources of our software developers that may be doing something else, so they will be making changes on the vocabularies that we use. So those are little very tangible things that are tangible. They may not sound that big, but they're signals that we care about that.
Melvin, your
Yeah,
thoughts?
so Intel, just like many other Silicon Valley companies, have historically demonstrated significant problems in dealing with underserved minorities and being able to understand the experience people of color and especially Black people have. It's, I think the murder of Breonna Taylor in her own home and George Floyd on television was an eye-opening experience to many people. Black people, of course, are affected in very different ways. And so at Intel, you know, when you layer that situation with the pandemic and working from home, Intel found itself in a position where it had to become more focused on the entire employee. How are we going to provide additional financial support, emotional and mental health support? How are we going to support transgender and LGBTQ communities in Intel? How are we going to take our ERGs and turn them on their head so that they are not insular, but they have an opportunity to share more details? And I'll just give you a small example that I think was eye-opening to most senior leaders. You know, this idea of code switching, which most Black people take for granted, most senior leaders had never even heard of. They really thought we talk like that when we're at home, when, even though we never do. And so understanding how code switching works, why it's such an important skill for a Black person to become familiar with and how to use, and being able to provide insight as to what it feels like to have to be able to be less than authentic when you're at work, I think was eye-opening. But what I will have to say is that our CEO owns this. Now this is a person who realizes that diversity and inclusion is a business imperative, just like supply chain, just like engineering, just like finance. And in spite of the fact that we have had a culture in the past of homogeneity at the senior leadership level, we have to treat this as an opportunity to change, just like we would change any other business imperative in a competitive space. We're going to have to create real plans beyond the listening session. What are we really going to do that's different? How are we going to hold people accountable? You know, one of our customers, JP Morgan Chase, has now tied their diversity inclusion plan to compensation. So they have eliminated the compensation of people who do not meet the D&I activities that the company has set forth. Now, we haven't gone that far, but I think there's a precedent being set that our ability to be competitive is not tangentially related to this diverse set of initiatives, but is core.
Yeah, I think, Melvin, what you just said, it's interesting because I think, you know, we at Google, we did come out with, you know, racial equity commitments to further the work and go beyond what we have already committed to doing in terms of DEI space. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of the work has been to say, let's double down on what we've been telling our leaders for years, right? And our organizations for years, and let's figure out how to actually get it done. And the way you do that is with that accountability that you were just speaking about. So, you know, I find that, you know, as much as I think we want to come up with, at Google, everybody wants to come up with creative ideas and new things, and everybody had thousands of ideas, and a lot of them are amazing, and we're going to implement some of them, right? But I think at the same time, we shouldn't totally abandon what we've been trying to work on in terms of representation at the leadership levels and equitable systemic change within, progression paths for underrepresented communities. So I think in a lot of ways, it's also just making sure that we have a continuous focus on it from a business side.
And so on that point, the point of ideas, so my company is part of the Quicken Loans family of companies, and team members submitted 10,000 ideas. From those ideas and those experiences and conversations, could you all share just some of the initiatives that you're working through that you think team members especially appreciate, or things where maybe when you guys threw it out there, team members like, okay, they're listening to us?
When I get a call from a senior vice president at home asking me, how am I doing? That's important. When I see our senior leadership asking people to block out whole sections of their calendar during the week for mental health sessions and rejuvenation or listening sessions, I know somebody's listening. When I hear people who self-correct when they catch themselves falling into their normal pattern, like interrupting women or repeating, or men repeating what women say even though they've already said it. This is good. This is all goodness. I think these are great things, but I do agree with Amanda, doubling down on what we've already done and then escalating even more. I think that what you'll have to see is a clear focus on accountability. People have to be held to a standard that everyone is held to. And when we see that kind of thing happen, I think then we'll see more substantive change.
When I think about
one of the things that, okay, I'll go, Amanda. One of the things that we hear when we're having these conversations with our own employees is that we have not been working with the community, the Black community, the Latinx community as an employer of choice. They don't know that this is one of the places where they come to work. And so to respond to that, when we listened to that, we said, well, in this virtual world, why don't we? So this is going to be my advertising of, we set up a virtual executive and career summit that we're going to run in a couple of weeks, just targeted to Black, Latinx, and Native American. Of course, anybody can come, but we realized that we wanted to show our leaders that belong to those communities that have been successful in our organization, and we wanted them to tell their stories of success so we could be attracted by, or we could be an attractive opportunity for other communities that were not thinking about us as an employer of choice. So that's an example of something that we heard, and yeah, we could have done any other conference, but now this is really targeted, and all our partnerships and all our employees are coming from the Black, Latinx, and Native American communities to represent who we are. Sorry, Amanda, your turn now.
No, it's okay. I mean, what you said just reminds me of what I was going to say as well is, underrepresented groups are, because we have a lack of representation at senior leadership levels in so many organizations, they're often left out of critical decision making around DEI initiatives, right? And we need to co-create and make sure that we have that voice heard. And when I think about DEI initiatives, I think about there's two kind of initiatives. There's the specific focus on, changing something equitably for a particular group. Oftentimes we do that by seeing what where the gaps are in the data. And then there's also the idea of embedding systemic change within our process so that everybody benefits, right? An example of that would be, a more objective hiring process with, criteria that's standard for when we interview candidates, that's going to benefit everybody. I think of also, when it comes to most recent initiatives that Google's put out, has been the student loan repayment. That was a direct result of realizing that student loan repayment disproportionately impacts women and communities of color. And so by doing that, we are helping everybody and who has student debt, right? But it is going to ultimately, help with that wealth gap that we see across racial lines.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the challenges that we're facing a little bit right now, because I think that many times people see diversity and inclusion as a zero-sum game. If somebody else wins, that means I have to lose, and that's really unfortunate. I also see. I live in Washington D.C., not in Silicon Valley, so I see the executive order that was put out by the administration and the impact that it's having, not just in government, but into commercial entities as well. And it is, clearly an uncomfortable conversation to have for many people. I get that 100%. And that's the reason why we need to have those conversations, though, because as uncomfortable as they might be, they represent the kinds of situations that we actually see when we listen and go to listening sessions. I'll share with you one of the things that happened to me that actually, shocked me, is that Black people are having to make decisions in their families and in their uh, tight circles about who they're going to associate with now, because of the choices that people have made around social justice activities. Um, Children have to decide whether or not to associate with mothers or fathers. Uh, Parents have to decide whether or not to engage their own spouses. And when you hear these stories through listening sessions at work, it just makes you want to cry. And to hear the kind of real life impacts that a lack of a focus on equity and social justice has on people, it really does crystallize why it's a business decision. Because if you come to work and you cannot focus on what you're trying to get done because you're absolutely concerned about whether or not you're going to be perceived as being here because of some special program, or you're not really worthy of being here, but we just let you in because we had to meet some kind of diversity and inclusion number, that takes you away from being very, very good at work. And make no mistake, uh, the idea that this is a meritocracy, that's simply not the case. This is not a meritocracy. In many cases, it has everything to do with the cultural experiences that the company and that the individuals are experiencing. And so while we want to continue to strive to have the best performance measures and to highlight how those contribute to our goals, we have to be honest with ourselves. And those listening sessions and then the actions that come out of them really, really do help crystallize why this is not a philanthropic good idea to do. This is really about a business imperative.
So then that also highlights, and I'll say, speaking for myself, so I run a team of about 75. I have Zennials, millennials, baby boomers, some who are going to retire in the next year. And these conversations have been very, I would say, eye-opening for all of us because of that generational divide in mindsets. And you kind of do it when you talked about, parents and children or someone with a partner dealing with these conversations. And so how do you guys see the different generations maybe changing mindsets, having productive discussions, or tangling with the idea of respect and having respectful conversations about issues that can be so tense and anxiety inducing?
Honestly, I would challenge the idea that there's this strict generational divide. I actually think it's more about how you grew up, what your values are, and what you were exposed to, and what you continue to be exposed to, and what is your interest in learning about other cultures, and learning about other experiences other than your own. You know, I lived in New York where I knew, you know, people who were much older than me, who are some of the most inclusive, you know, people that I've ever met. And then, you know, places that I've grown up and people that are my own age, don't have that view, right? Because they haven't sought out those experiences. So I don't think it's as easy as pointing it to one group. And I think it's more about having the curiosity and interest in going after things. And I think that having those conversations across those divides, whether it be generation, whether it be different political views, it's to step back from the politics. The politics is how, that's the policy, that's how you get things done, whatever. It's important, very important. But let's come back to a conversation about values and humanity. You know, I saw Dr. John A. Powell speak, you know, earlier this year around the protests. And, you know, I'll never forget what he said. He was the director of Belonging and Othering Institute at Berkeley. And he said, you have to be focused on and be clear about values and aspirations. It may seem like you're talking about politics, but we actually aren't. You know, there's just some things that are so fundamentally wrong that we should all stand up against it. And you know, we have to respect the humanity of a person and their experiences and validate those experiences, especially in this work.
Yeah, I would say that the farther we move away from D&I as a measure of compliance, and the closer we move it to a focus on values and performance, you know, the better. If you take a look at some of the work that we've done in trying to aggregate some insights, what we're finding is that 45% of the companies that have large and effective diversity programs are reporting significant growth in the market over their year-over-year measure. And 70% of these diverse companies are able to deal with disruptions better and be able to enter new markets faster. So, you know, almost everybody at Intel gets paid by company stock. Right? So, you know, so if you're trying to impact your compensation in a positive way, you know, no company is operating without significant disruption, competitive environment, and trying to gain new markets and market share. And if somebody told me that I could use diversity and inclusion as a tool to get there, then I want to do that. Now, I also do want to talk, Stephanie, about this generational thing. I know we used to talk about this idea of harmonizing this generational gap or so-called generational gap by these kind of, I'll call them unintentional collisions, right? We're gonna let people gravitate to the people who they like to hang out with, and hopefully they'll mix up and they'll find ways to understand what other people are going through. Well, we've kind of learned that these unintentional collisions need to be refocused to become intentional collisions. We need people who have very, very different views about the world to be talking to one another. And so this year I became responsible for Intel China from an AI perspective. And you know, if you live in the United States, there's a lot of people who think China is the enemy. And that's a very difficult thing to comprehend if you are trying to grow market share in China as part of your company. I think what we found is when we intentionally moved people together from different countries, different backgrounds, there was an increased appreciation for how people think, how they solve problems, what kinds of things they use to solve those problems, methods and tools. Not trying to change anybody's mind about Black Lives Matter or anything like that at all. Just trying to get people to understand that there's a rocket fuel that this company needs to be able to ignite. And that rocket fuel is diversity and inclusion.
So then you bring up a good point, and I think I'd love to hear from Elizabeth as well. In this environment, also fueled by COVID-19 and some of the challenges that it's raised, have your companies had to change strategy because now you can't do as many of those unconscious, or I would say spontaneous conversations between people of those different backgrounds. I know we're even doing this on Zoom now. So how is that coming across in the webinar or the online meeting to give people that kind of space?
So yeah, we have come up with a lot of new tools for managers to understand how to manage virtually, and also give them ideas on how to engage with others. We started everybody with, social hours, and then we realized happy hours. Well, not everybody drinks. So how do you create an environment where everybody feels welcome? And so there are groups that have the early morning. So simple things that got people to think differently about their own teams and how they operate and the things that they may have not known of their teams. Now we're much more comfortable on having people around us like me making noise around us while I'm trying to speak here, but we are having children and animals. And but what it has been very interesting for us is we really thought of working in the offices as being the only productive way. And we had to reset some of our tools and some of the ways that we create and we innovate on behalf of our customers in a different way that we had before. So that this has been a very interesting and exciting way to innovate and build on the entrepreneurial abilities of our employees to do things in a different way. But we are also checking on the well-being of our employees. So as I mentioned to you, we do inclusion questions. We have a question per day, every day of the year. And that's the way that we survey our employees. And there were a lot of questions that we had changed really to understand the experience of working from home. What were the obstacles people were having and how to fix those? So, in the old days, you will come to the office the first day that so you start with a company and get all from your ID to your computer. Then we had to change all those processes to be able to continue to hire thousands of employees and come up with those. But then we wanted to say, how is that experience? How do we create an environment and how do we remind our leaders? So we're using the same system that allows you to ask a question to nudge our managers and remind them if they have a new employee, these are the kind of things. We're now checking on managers in the 30 days and 60 days to check on the performance of the new employees. So they get aware of the work that they need to do as managers. So those are some of the examples of working from home and understanding that the experience is really different. We keep on looking at our numbers. So as for you probably seen in a lot of publications about more women leaving the workforce. And we are checking every other week on our attrition, and we're not seeing that, we're not having that experience. But that's, again, something that we bring from the outside, and we're trying to ensure that it doesn't happen to us.
Amanda, do you feel a similar innovation or shift? I know you're a business partner, so you work with different leadership teams and groups as part of implementing these initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the amazing thing at Google is we have a very grassroots culture. Employees, that was the biggest thing I noticed. I joined Google in February. And the biggest change I noticed is that people just create, and maybe that's also unique to the tech industry. But, I think that there have been a lot of different ideas and things that have gone viral, in terms of initiatives that are very exciting and encouraging to this space. And it's amazing to see so much passion. And I think that for me, the best thing to do, especially as a business partner, I think about this a lot, is how do you kind of leverage that passion in the business and that ability to influence in a way that we can't if we're on the HR side, right? How can you leverage that and connect with that in the same way with my own DEI expertise, and be able to kind of marry that to create the best initiatives for our employees, so that it's not just HR telling you to do something, right? But that it's actually a connection of making sure that we're designing equitably, and that's kind of my key role, but also that we're getting all these ideas that are really started in the accountability from the business side.
Yes, definitely. We've had to make a significant pivot and shift. And so there are a couple of things that happened almost immediately. First, our chief diversity officer, who was a vice president, was moved up into the senior vice president role. So that person who used to be not in the most senior leadership role now is in the most senior leadership role, reporting directly to the CEO. As I mentioned, our CEO now has monthly D&I sessions. That never happened before. I can tell you that for sure. And I think the number that's most impactful to us is that we found that when our product development teams have a team member who shares the same client ethnicity, the same ethnicity as one of our clients, that team has 152% higher likelihood that they'll be able to create a product that's going to resonate with that client. And so from a business perspective, they were like, well, wait a minute, is that really true? And it turns out that it is. So when we start looking at the drivers that change how we affect who's getting the prime spots, or who's getting the funding for R&D, or who's getting the so-called pet projects that are going to drive the business in the future, we know if we really want to become the kind of product company that's going to resonate with our clients and our customers, then we have to have a diverse team. And I think that has also been a significant pivot before. Now, of course, I'm not in the D&I section. So if you talk to Barbara, who's our chief D&I officer, she would probably give you all these other metrics associated with underrepresented minorities and how we recruit and retain in those programs. But from the senior leader in the company who's responsible for one of the 4 core business pillars that our whole company rests on, artificial intelligence, I can tell you that we've had to make a shift. It's as simple as things like understanding that Black people are disproportionately impacted by COVID. That had a significant impact on the response to our employees on a work from home kind of schedule and how we were going to create a work from home program. And so that's the kind of thing that I think we've seen has been pretty successful.
So I'll ask one more question for each of the panelists from kind of our pre-selected questions. And then I'm going to hit a few that came up in the Q&A. And I'll just plug one last time that Q&A section. Oh, I just saw a question come in. Thank you. Use it. We do want to get to these. So I provided a little extra time. So for each of our panelists, just thinking concretely, what's something each of us can do to further these goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
This is everybody's role. If you're a manager, if you're a senior leader, if you are in operations, in technology, this is not the role of these groups. This is your role as a manager. We actually see a high correlation on high scores for inclusion and high scores for manager satisfaction. So managers that lead in an inclusive way, they get more out of their employees. So if you think about this in a very practical way, what you want is you want employees that come and perform at the highest level that they could. So having high levels of inclusion, and in our case, we decided to define inclusion for Amazon. So we use 4 different categories. It is being connected, being trusted, being informed, and being valued. Every company can define other talks about belonging. You have to decide what that is and ensure that your managers understand that that's their expectation to lead with inclusion. And of course, they need to think about and being intentional around diversity. So we know that it doesn't happen organically for all the things that Melvin and Amanda had shared. So we need to be intentional. You need to look at your team and say, who's missing at the table? Because if they're missing at your table, you're not thinking that as your customer. And as a company that really think about being customer obsessed, we need to bring that experience to our customers inside so we can solve for their needs. So those are the 2 things that we need to continue to get all And when I use the word leaders, I'm not just thinking about those who have supervisory responsibility, but those who lead their careers, who lead in their organization to be connected to this work and being accountable for this work.
Amanda, your thoughts?
I mean, there's so many resources out there in this space and it changes all the time. I mean, I think that, to be honest, it's about educating yourself and taking the time. I think that if you're a hiring manager, if you're like a leader, I think there are a number of things that you can do. And I hate to say that it starts and ends with leadership, because that's not true. Everybody can do something for D&I, but the biggest impact, I think the biggest change we can make in an organization is when, leaders really make this a priority and a focus. So if you are a leader, do that, right? Figure out how to create your own plan around your, OKRs, your objectives, your results that you want to make and drive, and make sure that your team holds yourself accountable. I think just as an individual contributor or just, anybody on a team, it's just figuring out and taking time to do some research and read about, systemic inequities. And there's just so many good people out there. I know there's been a number of resources that have been shared in the last few months, from Ibram X. Kendi to Rachel Cargill and a number of people. Like I said, I think it's just taking the time to make it your priority.
Yeah, I would say two things. Listen with the intent of understanding. You may not agree with the person. There's many things that I hear that I don't agree with, but at least I try and understand where the person's coming from, and I try and give them a viewpoint that is not necessarily confrontational, but certainly clear and firm. And I think to the extent that we can create what we have characterized as a speak up culture, the CEO can't be in every meeting. So when people see things happening, there's a responsibility and opportunity to speak up and say, hey, you know what, that's not right. That's not representative of Intel values. We need to think of things in a little different light. When we hear managers from other companies say, well, we would love to have more Black people in senior leadership roles, we just can't find them. We know that is not representative of a person who's listening to understand. That is a representative of a desire to continue the same kind of dialogue that has been out there in the past. So what we're really suggesting is that people need to speak up, be your authentic self at work. And I think not only will you feel better as an individual, but the company will definitely prosper.
So with that, I'll shift to some of the questions that came in through our Q&A, and if it's directed at someone, I'll say so. Otherwise, my assumption is it's open to all panelists. So one of the first questions is, what have you found to be most effective in shifting an organization from treating D&I like a check mark to making it a core value?
So everybody at Intel has to take diversity, inclusion, and ethics training. That's not going to change. What's changed is we're holding people accountable now. The ability to hold people accountable is got a marvelous impact. It sends a clear and distinct message that we have to make a change.
So for us, we included that in our mechanism. So we have monthly reviews, monthly business reviews, and quarterly business reviews. And now that is part of what leaders are expecting their teams to report on. So they all have to, maybe your numbers haven't changed, but what have you done to affect those numbers, and how are you planning for the future? So we don't assume that this is a one quarter fix all the problems of racial injustice, but then what are you doing to continue to do this work? So we incorporated in our mechanisms, and that was the best way to continue working on this.
I probably have a word count for using the word systemic by now on this panel, but I do think, there are things that are check the box, right? And I think there's a lot of things around awareness. that are great. I mean, it's great to attend a training for 2 hours, but at the end of the day, that's 2 hours that it's just giving you some awareness. You're not going to come away with a whole new behavior change after that, right? It's committing to doing those behaviors time over time. And then also from, the DEI side, I think it's making sure that we are driving systemic process change and building in things into our processes that allow us to have more equitable outcomes for our underrepresented populations that ultimately will benefit everybody, but specifically focused on where are we seeing the gaps and what can we do to solve for them on the back end, as well as I think, like, as much as we want to have leadership accountability, we can't expect our leaders to remember every single day. We hope that we do, right? But we have to have those mechanisms in place on the back end from a process side too.
No, I agree with you, Amanda, and please don't ever stop talking about systemic, because I think that's actually part of the most significant concern that I have, that people believe that the issues around diversity and inclusion are kind of like accidental. Oh, I didn't mean to do that, and that's not very egregious, and but in reality, when you're the object of these activities, it has a systemic feel to it. And without question, there are systems in place that are not equitable. And so, we definitely need to have process change. And I applaud you for continuing to harp on that. You got my support.
Okay. Good.
And so this one, I think maybe we'll lean to the alums to give their first impression, but this one asks, what specifically should William and Mary and the business school be doing to prepare graduates so that they could contribute meaningfully to these efforts in the workplace? And I think some of our students are also watching, and so good tips for them as well.
I mean, as an alum, I fell into DEI work. I'll be honest with you. I was always passionate about it. I grew up in St. Louis, an incredibly racially segregated community, actually, on the opposite side. I grew up being the only white girl in my class. And then I went to William and Mary, and I'm not going to lie, it wasn't the most diverse, right? And so I didn't know about DEI as much until I fell into it and did DEI analytics and in the consulting space, and then went on to do other work. But I think that you don't expect to just fall into it. You have to be intentional. So when you join a company, or when you are rising in your role, figure out how to embed that work into your job. When you're a new graduate, join ERGs, employee resource groups, business resource groups, whatever they're called, right? Join efforts when they, ask for volunteers to help with DEI efforts. I think just getting involved absolutely is key.
And so the other question that came up, maybe dovetailing on that, is what keeps each of you up at night regarding inclusion in the work of your organization? What's the one thing that you're like, oh, if I could tackle this, like I would start tackling this?
I think that what we said before, the sustainability of this. And again, some of us have been in this work for a long time. We are in a peak where senior leaders want to talk about that, want to understand, want to be curious, want to listen. So we need to continue to have that same level of motivation from organizations and do the hard work. This is not easy work. So trying to look back to your values and some of the things that may be so embedded in what the organizations are and how they were written. Were they written really for the dominant culture, or were they written for a diverse organization? And some of those things are difficult to get organizations to rethink how, when, and how, and then what do we do for the future? So what keeps me up at night is the feeling that this may pass. I know it won't for my company, but it may for others, and that we really disappoint a community that is engaged to do better and wants for us to be better.
Yeah, does it feel like, I mean, I guess maybe for me, it feels like this is like our moment. And so between some of my team members have protested or people are doing a lot of work with the election, it feels like there's so much energy and magnetism around it. And so do you feel like it could end or it ebbs off?
I think
Nope,
we're
Hope it
constantly,
doesn't.
yeah. I mean, I think in this type of work, though, you're constantly going to be fighting. We haven't solved systemic racism in 400 plus years, right? So I think that it's not going to go away overnight. I think that we do have to fight to keep it as a front issue, though. I think you saw a number of people posting the black box on Instagram and, you know, posting resources in the wake of the protests. And I see some people still doing that, but which is good. I mean, at the end of the day, if some people are still doing it, then it means that some people have been fundamentally changed and are really trying to work. I think that we just have to constantly put this as the focus and not let it out of sight, because it will fall back, because people do. There are a number of people out there who don't believe the DEI is a business priority, right? And so I'm lucky enough to work at a company that really does. And, you know, not to say that we've solved anything, right? There's just so much work to do.
I think the thing that keeps me up at night is this formidable backlash that's starting to foment around these initiatives. I think there is, without question, a segment of the population who don't believe that there's anything to this discussion at all. There's people who believe that there is no merit to a conversation around social justice, and that we live in a country that is going to reward those people who work hard and pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and there's no real difference, you know. And so what I'm most concerned about is our ability and our reaction to that backlash. What is actually going to happen as a result of that? Because that's real. And you know, when I hear, you know, as a member of the federal government premier law enforcement agency, when I hear people talk about social justice organizations the same way that they do with organizations that are on the terrorist watch list, it gives me pause. it gives me pause. And so, you know, it makes me wonder whether or not we really have come as far as we would like to. It certainly provides me the kind of energy and passion to keep on furthering. You know, I'm very fortunate to work at a company that has decided they are going to take a real stance around this issue and not lip service. But again, we have a long way to go as well, right? We still have things that are needing to be changed, and so I'm hoping that we answer this backlash with the kind of passion and understanding that can lead to real change.
I think it also comes back. All right.
Go ahead.
I think it also comes back to what Elizabeth was saying earlier, though, about the fact that culture change. I've always felt this way. I've worked in culture work for a long time, and you know, everybody be like, let's do a weekly survey to see how the culture has shifted. And it's like, it doesn't happen in a week. It doesn't happen in a day, and it takes a long time, and that can be overwhelming and exhausting, because we're working against systemic forces inside, outside, everywhere, where we're seeing processes that have been put in place that allow this dominant culture, that allow you know, all of this that have caused all these issues, right, to happen. And so I think that you know, breaking it down, focusing on what we can do to make incremental progress is really important. You know, and then I think not only is it exhausting, but it's but we can't let it go, you know. And that's like the things that keep me up at night, is I don't get to leave this work and I don't get to turn this work off, especially recently. But in general, like like people who come into this work, I can't speak for Elizabeth. I can't speak for Melvin. And I know you're not in the DI space, but still, I feel like you got some expertise going on there. But I think that we don't come into this space because it's just a 9-to-5 job. It's a passion. It's something that drives us every single day, and it's inside and outside of work, and it just doesn't end for us. It's something you constantly are thinking about.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't change for me, Amanda, because every time I leave my house, no matter where I go, I have to call my wife to let her know that I'm actually going to be able to come home. When my 2 children leave out of the house, I have to make sure I know the 2 little Black boys, where they're going, who they're going to be with, when are they expected to get back, and if they're not back, what do I need to do? And that's, that's never going to stop. That's happened to me when I was little. I'm sure that happened to my parents when they were little. When my children have children, that's going to happen as well. And so, yeah, there's no off button for Black people around this issue. We are still going to be focused on this issue long after other people have figured, well, you know what, we've had a Black president, so we don't need to worry about that anymore. It's all good.
Yeah. So I want to answer to something that you say, and not to diminish what you had said, because you're totally right. Your experience in the world is very different than mine, and I can listen and I can learn, but I don't have to worry when my son goes out in his bicycle the way that you do. So I don't want to, but there was something that you said before that made me think of, this idea of the backlash and the power that we have as corporations to make changes. And I'll tell you what reminded me. When you think about civil rights for the LGBT communities, it was really the corporations that were pushing ahead, and they were giving benefits to our LGBT community employees before the government was decided if they could or could not marry. So I think that you have here 3 of the biggest organizations in technology that are committed to this work, and we can make pressure to say, you know what, we're not going to agree with the executive order. We're going to still believe that we need to have these conversations, and we will have to deal with that because it is who we are and the values, and we believe in the goodness of our organizations. And that's what it reminded me when you were talking about that we can't just, there's going to be backlash. There was backlash also for the LGBT community, and companies stand up to that and say, this is who we are. We're going to go and walk pride. We're going to give benefits. We're going to be inclusive. And that's what we stand for.
No, you're absolutely right, Elizabeth. That does give us hope. And that's something that is very substantive. And that is something that's very, very, very hopeful.
And so maybe to switch gears a little bit, but similar in vein, a question came up about intersectionality. And so you guys are talking about continuing this moment, using the influence and ability of large companies to really be ahead of the curve when it comes to sustaining change. And so how does that connect with the idea of, our disabled members of the community, our veteran members of the community, those who have different cultural backgrounds? How are you guys bringing them to the table? Sometimes it feels like people have pushed the discussion to only be a Black-white discussion, but there are disabled people of all backgrounds, veterans of these backgrounds. And so how do we think about inclusivity when it comes to them too?
I think it's conversation about privilege, right? And to some degree, I think that when it comes to intersectionality, I think about the visible and invisible traits that you have that afford you opportunities in your life. Taking my background, for example, probably no surprise, I'm a white woman, so I have been afforded a number of privilege and opportunities because of my race, and then, have experienced issues because of my gender. And then I've been afforded, but that's just race and gender, right? There's a number of opportunities around, what my privileges are in terms of, physical ability, and then opportunities I have within mental health. I think that's true for everybody, right? So I think a lot of our conversation has been, how can we move beyond just the binary of race and gender into understanding those experiences? It is challenging at an organization to track metrics and progress against this because we have limited access to data. But I think that creating conversational space where you can talk about your different experiences and understand all the divergent experiences, for example, of the Black community, right? There's a number of different experiences. Black trans lives matter, I know, has become a huge focus of the Black Lives Matter as well. So I think that it's wildly important to focus on intersectionality.
Yeah, I know that as a data scientist and other data scientists at the business school, they're spending, we as scientists spend a lot of time on bias in algorithms, bias in the use of data sets. And so this is not at all different than the kind of bias that can be applied to many different areas, not just racial and gender. I think this idea of intersectionality is important specifically for institutions of higher learning because they have an opportunity to affect how close students get to this diverse environment. Do they have an opportunity to pull students from different orientations into the student body? Or do they make it intentional to drive programs like this one at William and Mary, where there's an honest and open discussion about these issues? I think this is an absolute beautiful conversation to have, because I have to tell you, I serve on a number of boards of other organizations, and they are absolutely reticent to having even this kind of conversation at all. Don't want to have it, don't want to hear about it, don't want to do it. So I think that in terms of intersectionality, there's a number of key facets that we need to be aware of, and that and unfortunately, while we don't have the kind of data that we would like to have often, we can be cognizant of the fact that there are biases that can be noticed and then can be changed.
So then 2 questions came up, and maybe I'll tie them together. One asked, Amanda earlier alluded to educating yourself and saying for each person, you need to do the work yourself and learn. And so maybe a few resources that put people in the right direction towards that education piece. And then the second part of that is, what are some of the lessons that you guys have learned in your organization when you were in the early stages of putting an initiative together, or some hurdles that you dealt with along the way?
Well, I will tell you that as a result of spending more introspection time, I have come to realize that I have some significant personal work to do with respect to bias. I had an opportunity to take a number of courses that probably weren't directed at me directly, but I was able to take, and I realized that there's some decisions that I make that are representative of unfounded bias, that don't make any sense whatsoever, and that I need to be completely more locked into and make some significant change. I definitely needed to think about that. I will say that for me, being responsible for R&D in a Silicon Valley company means that we get a chance to pick some unique investment opportunities. Intel Capital is the largest corporate venture capital organization in the world when it comes to artificial intelligence. And so the initiative that I sparked as a result of the pivot we made was to identify more AI founders that are in the seed and pre-seed stage, not the kind that we would typically invest in, but the kind that we can actually help grow. So this is a great initiative that I'm excited to be part of.
Amanda?
Oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, no, I was going to say building on the introspections and who do you follow? What are the tweets that you follow? Who are the channels that you follow? And pull yourself. When was the last time that you watched a movie with all Black crew that it was not a Black Panther? Okay, really. and when you start asking your questions, you go like, I haven't, I didn't. Did you think about, going into, and those are simple things. Those are not about, buying a big book and learning about diversity, but who is in your circle of information. And as we know, the algorithm will repeat whatever you like. So push yourself to looking for other speakers, other voices. And we started doing that in our team and saying, okay, give me things that you know for sure, team members, Elizabeth is not listening to this. And they will just, give me new music that I would have not run into unless someone was intentional. And I knew that I couldn't find it by myself. I needed to reach out to my team to help me doing that. So anybody can do that. You can reach out to other people that will come from a different background and really ask them to help you expand your listening circles.
Yeah. I think, yeah, taking note of who you follow and because I think also going to that intersectionality component, making sure that you have the perspectives of not just like a cisgender person, but also, someone who is maybe Black and has the trans experience or the gender fluidity experience or Latinx and who has that, or someone who has, a person with disabilities, from a different race or other background, right? There's so many different ways to think about like your network and who you watch and who you listen to. And I love the idea of talking about introspection, because I think the more you learn about, I think about like, it's a metaphor, but right, the iceberg. When you think about an iceberg, you think about what's visible and what's invisible. What's visible is your behaviors and how you react. And then thinking about what's underneath is the patterns that have caused you to react that way. What are the cultural influences? What are the values you've been taught from a very young age? All of those things influence how you act. And I'll tell you a personal, anecdote. I moved here to the Bay Area in February, like I mentioned, for this job from New York. And I remember standing on the subway platform, and out of the corner of my eye, somebody just kind of looked like they were rushing up to me, and I jumped. It was a Black man handing me a pamphlet. I don't know what it was about. I can't remember, but I do remember my reaction. And I thought to myself, why did I do that? And I thought to myself of, what I heard a long time ago was be fascinated with your own bias, be fascinated with your own racism, debunk the theory that you don't have it. Everybody's been, grown up around certain values and institutions and patterns that have caused us to react in a certain way and have those behaviors. And so when you think about that experience that I had, I began to break it down a little bit and think, did I do that because that was a Black man and I've been taught that way, right? To be scared of Black men. Have I been taught to be scared of men in general because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm in New York City? Is it simply that I was just frightened and scared? I don't know, honestly, right? I don't know what my implicit biases are that caused me to react that way, or if it was biased or not. But I just think, taking situations like that and just being really fascinated by them, curious with what you as a person are doing, you won't be able to unsee it. And you can go through life and I think constantly just kind of unravel what you're doing day to day. And then over time, that's going to create behavior change as well.
So as we move towards the end, I think there's two questions. One is, it says everyone here kind of works in that big tech space. Where do you see the industry coexisting with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in 20 years? And then what do you hope will be the biggest transformation?
Well, let me just say that diversity improves performance in very small companies even more. So we have a very large supply chain. And so one of the things we started doing is looking at the smaller companies that feed our supply chain to determine how they're attracting and retaining great talent. Mm-hmm. And when we looked and studied those and started ranking them against a diversity construct, we found that the more diverse companies lead to better products and services. They do better at keeping their costs down, raising their profitability. They go into new markets with us faster. They have a broadened perspective. So the benefits that we get from a small company are force multipliers for a big company. For the ones that we see in a big company, they are force multipliers for a small company, sorry. I will say that I'm hopeful especially given the two panelists that we have on this panel with me. You know, I'm very, very hopeful that we are going to get to a point where even people who have the most different views than us, we won't find it requires us to respond back to them with hate. The kind of response that I think we will get to will be, okay, you know what? I can disagree with you, but let's go have a beer. Because, you know, hating somebody just because they hate what you believe, this is not productive. It is not productive. It doesn't help. It doesn't go anywhere. So if you, when I find myself in a situation, and it's often that I find myself in situations where people have feelings that I find abhorrent, I know that there may be some extenuating circumstance in their life that made them that way. And being hateful to them is not the answer to solving the problem. So I'm maybe just because I'm an optimist, maybe just because I'm hanging around all these smart women, the moderator and the two panelists, you know, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah, Amanda, I think you hit on it as well, talking about getting to the humanity of people in conversations and then, you know, questioning yourself. And so definitely so many just good points around the table here. It has been a true pleasure to speak to you. Elizabeth, Amanda, any last words for our group?
Go, Amanda.
Yeah. I guess I think about the humanity aspect, right? And, you know, I gave examples of the, you know, how to move forward and change your behaviors, right? When you know you've done something wrong and understanding what was behind that. But also, I think about getting back to the humanity and the values conversations. I think it is very hard to not, like what Melvin, you were just saying, I think it's extremely hard not to respond with anger. I find myself in conversations with my parents who don't necessarily have the same beliefs that I do. And it's very hard to be in those conversations and not get angry, especially when it's with family and friends that you've known and loved for years and you realize they don't have the same values as you, maybe, right? That's very hard. I think that asking why, trying to understand where someone's coming from. Why do you think that? Okay, what caused you to believe that? All right, what situation were you in where this troubled you? And asking more questions when you're having these difficult conversations can help you kind of find a root cause, and maybe just, you know, understand someone's own experiences in a way that you can start to build bridges and move forward. I'm not saying it's going to solve everything. We're in an incredibly divided environment right now. But, you know, moving away from the politics and what leaders are saying right now to what our own personal experiences are and how we can build bridges there, I think is going to be just the most important thing to move forward with.
That's great. So I'm going to take both of Melvin's and Amanda and say, as technology organizations, we have a responsibility. We need to understand our biases. We have the power to create AI that is as unbiased as possible, algorithms that will play in different ways, and scale that knowledge to other organizations, as well as looking for small startups that may not be your typical startup, and how we're going to support them with resources so they get to produce what they believe is important to our customers. So I see that, you know, we have an opportunity in the tech industry to change the conversation, and we need to do that. We need smart people that want to come and work in our organizations and do the best for our customers. So it's not something that if it doesn't happen, it will not impact, it will impact our bottom line if we don't have enough scientists that want to bring their varied and diverse experience to our organization for us to be successful. So that's fine.
So Elizabeth, 1:29 on the dot. I want to thank you guys so much for giving us your time today, for answering these questions. Thank you, Dean Pulley, for again creating a space for these conversations, and to the Mason D&I committee. I mean, without you guys, without people creating this space, so many of these conversations wouldn't happen. So we just thank you so much for being here and giving us your time. And I thank all the participants for coming on and listening today. So I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.